Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Metzler, one of the programmers at SF DocFest. As you might have heard, this is the 25th anniversary of the festival. We've been bringing some of the most interesting, cool, and weird documentaries from around the world to the Bay Area for the last 25 years. And, um, we run across films in so many different ways. And, from submissions to like what other festivals and people are recommending to us. And you just saw the really great documentary Wall Black, which I had a chance to kind of see some clips of last year at a pitch session and was kind of excited to kind of see where the film went. So it was neat that everything kind of worked out. Now we have Wall Black at SF Doc Fest, and when we have one of the co-directors here, Sydney. Welcome.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. I'm Sydney Fussell.
Well, thanks again for being here. I think maybe the first place to start would be like, what was the catalyst for this film that you knew that you just kind of wanted to kind of pick up the reins and say, hey, there's a movie here to be made?
Yeah, I would say in 2020, just before George Floyd's murder, I was working as a tech reporter at Wired. And so I was looking at social media and AI and the way that we were starting to see those impacts across different spheres. And then when I had heard that there was a George Floyd video, I did my best to avoid it because there had been so many other videos between Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Rodney King. And the first time I did actually see it, it was on Instagram, popped up out of nowhere, and it was right next to a SpongeBob meme and then like a movie trailer. And they were all treated exactly the same, just pieces of content streaming through the feed. And seeing the video, seeing the like counter and the comment counter, seeing the way that the reactions were being quantified, I was both struck by the tragedy that was happening of the murder, but then also the way that our reaction to the tragedy was being quantified and counted and turned into essentially ad revenue. So I really wanted to look at something that explored both the realities of what happened, the person who shot the video behind the camera, and then also like how that all fit into our sort of like AI social media landscape, and seeing the way that Silicon Valley was using this and other videos for their own profit. So we started in early 2021. I met with my producer in Shin, and we started doing early research, reaching out to a couple people, starting early, sort of like grant writing. And about a year later, we got our first little bite at the fish hook, and then we just kind of build from there.
So, as you kind of started going down that path, were there, you know, um, the people that kind of share their stories from kind of behind the camera on your camera, like, were people hesitant to kind of participate in the sense that like they kind of were forced into the public eye, and like how have they each kind of navigated in the sense of like decided to kind of collaborate with you?
Yeah, great question. I would say that of our protagonists, each one took about a year. So I'd say Darnella took about a year, Diamond took about a year, and then Laura King was definitely more forthcoming, but there was still like a get to know you process. And I would say starting with Diamond, who we filmed with first, it was very clear that she had been mistreated, that there was a lot of promises that were made to her, both politicians were bringing her out and saying, we're going to make these changes, change these laws, make things better. That didn't work out. Then, of course, the media coverage was negative. And then, as she mentions in the film, 4 years later, when George Floyd happened, everything that was promised and everything that she had, been told completely disappeared. And we restarted this new cycle of essentially the same promises, the same politicians, the same unfair media coverage. And so the first thing I did with Diamond, which I drew on from my journalism background, was I was just very upfront about there's an inherent power imbalance to filmmaking, to storytelling. Storytelling is extractive. It doesn't matter if I'm just calling you for a few quotes or I'm in your house with her family, as we were recording with her. Like, it's her story. We're taking it, we're putting it out there. And she definitely, it was a little bit of a gamble because it's like, we're going to take this from you. We're going to sit you down for hours, go through all these things. But I think she really responded to how honest we were about the imbalance. And that was something that she mentioned, that media coverage, they were always promising these things that won't happen. So being completely upfront about the imbalance was really, really important. Being specific about how this could be different from prior coverage. And then also, like, I'm Black, my co-director's Black, like, we both wanted to show that this was something that was being led by Black people who were trying to ask questions that were informed by um, the story, but also taking it a different direction, both with the technological angle and also just showing like the bravery of the witnesses and how they made the best decisions that they could. And later when we met with Darnella, it was the same thing. We talked to her mom, we talked to her lawyer, we scheduled around what worked for her. And if she wasn't able to make the shoot, she wasn't able to make the shoot. So definitely I would say being upfront about the imbalances was important. And I would also say that realizing that the relationship with the protagonist was going to be non-linear, I'll say. So there'd be times where we're good and we're rock and rolling, they're responsive and we're lining things up. And there's going to be times where they pull away and things are a little bit, paused and we haven't heard anything. And then we're going to go back to things being good and just allowing that to be the process and then not panicking or putting pressure on them as that process went up and down. Because certainly, like, we have deadlines, we're writing for grants, we're trying to get shoots done, et cetera, but those are not their deadlines. So realizing this is going to be a little rocky, we're not going to panic and we're not going to transfer any of that panic or that pressure onto our subjects was very, very important.
That's very cool. I mean, the phrase gets overused sometimes. It's that kind of holistic approach, I think, really kind of shines. Like, I wouldn't have known that you guys had done that, right? But I think there's something with a kind of care and intimacy in the film, that
Mm.
that vibrates from just the film itself, Um,
Thank
so,
you. I appreciate that.
yeah, it's interesting just to kind of like, you just never know how a filmmaker, makes a film, but like it's interesting how that just kind of becomes the bones of things in some.
Well, that's because the movie's finished. I think if you'd asked me while we were in it, my answer when now the movie's finished and out there, I'm happy to say, oh, it was a great process. It was wonderful. But yeah, definitely I understand that when you're in the middle of it, it can be difficult.
Yeah, well, the thing I think that is a commonality that run into with conversations with so many filmmakers, and even as a filmmaker myself, is that it's this, when you start a film, it's this leap of faith, right? It's like you have an idea of what you want, but like the final film is going to be different than what you envisioned at the beginning, and you just also don't know the path you're going to get there. So
Yeah.
sometimes, I mean, we have a film that's in the festival that's really great. I think it took 12 or 15 years to make. And some people
Mm.
wonder, they're like, well, why does it take so long? And it's just like,
Well,
there's a
yeah.
backstory. There's a backstory to every film.
Completely. Completely. I mean, this took about 5 years. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, it takes so long. And I remember, one of the great things about this process is that I've been able to, we met at a pitch fest. So I was able to go to different pitch fests and I was able to go to different markets and meet different people and meet other filmmakers as they're working on their projects. And so that was when I realized that 5 years isn't that long. It is long. I mean, it certainly was a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of intense, very intense, rigor. But like I would say that talking to other people and being like, oh, this took 5 years, like, yeah, okay, this took 9, this took 12, this took 15. And so that just really released a lot of pressure on me of like, oh, why is it taking so long? Like, what about YZ? But like realizing like that's the norm and that the care and the intensity and the unwillingness to compromise, all those things are part of that process. And what I would say when we were going to the market, it wasn't this film has taken a long time. I was like, this film was very tested. Like we've been tested against like funding dropping out, people withdrawing, subjects rescheduling last minute, filming across different locations, filming in we did one shoot in Canada, so it's like we're international. Like, so we've been tested against all these different things. So that's kind of like the mindset I adopted. It didn't take a long time. It was very well tested.
But I think it all paid off. And, this next question's a little bit of a, like, I'm trying to challenge a little bit of how to best ask it. But like, when you started off making this film, um, I think so many things in society, I think many of us hope for was kind of pivoting in a certain direction. And you
Mm-hmm.
kind of, talked about some of this idea of like with the Castile, killing, the idea is like there's all these promises, and then basically it's like things were back to square one 4 years later. unfortunately, it's like I feel like we're back to square one or even further back,
Mhm.
than when you started the film. And so, can you tell us about like, you know, you know, making a film that doesn't kind of exist in a bubble? And so, did you have to kind of like recalibrate or reshape of like the ways you decided you wanted to approach telling the story because of the changes going on in the bigger world, or did that not really kind of affect things?
I would say it was the opposite. If anything, it was difficult to find a container for the film because so many of the things that were happening just bolstered our point about the cyclical nature of Black trauma, about the way that we see this language of progress being adopted, then discarded, depending on the way the cultural pendulum is swinging. And similarly, a lot of the film takes place in Minneapolis and has to deal with the law enforcement apparatus, the way that the federal government was involved in essentially occupying Minneapolis during the uprisings. And then, obviously, right when we were finishing the film, you saw ICE agents in Minneapolis. You saw them using surveillance devices against protesters. You saw them essentially occupying using military war strategies. And so it
Yeah.
wasn't so much that, oh, now things are different, we have to change. It's more that things are intensifying, and it's like, should we add this? Should we add that? It felt like the
Mhm.
effect was one of, how do we trust the container that we've created and say this is the film? And while it's extremely resonant with these other things, I think we're allowing the audience to make the obvious connections between what we cover and what happened afterwards. So I would say that while the
Mhm.
film covers the period of 2020 to 2025, beginning with George Floyd's murder and then ending with the memorial, it every single thing that happened after we filmed felt like it was bolstering and really resonating with the points, unfortunately. So I
Yeah.
would say it wasn't about having to change anything. It was just like trying to resist that urge to just grab every new thing, and just really trusting that the stories that we hear from the witnesses firsthand was enough to prove our point, and that we didn't need to keep adding new things.
Right. No, that's it's an interesting thing about in the sense of like, yeah, so basically in some ways it's like what happened afterwards was not surprising just based on
Mm-hmm.
the history. I mean, I think the thing that's really, interesting about your film that struck me is that like, you know, at first glance one might think like, okay, this is kind of a current affairs or contemporary documentary, which obviously the subjects are, but it really is a timeless film, And I think I mean, that's kind of where its power is, in the sense like you can kind of enter it in several different ways. And it's really, a more kind of like universal story than just a story about, some events, the events kind of provide, some interesting entry points because of, unfortunately, how tragic and familiar we are with them.
Mm-hmm.
Did, since you're telling a story about in some ways, the media. Did that affect, as a filmmaker, how you wanted to kind of visually, capture the stories or even in the editing, and how did that kind of influence the aesthetic?
Yeah, I mean, we made the decision very early on that we were going to be very discerning with how much we saw of these videos, and we would edit them in certain ways so that we're not being gratuitous, we're not repeating the trauma, we're not triggering any of the witnesses themselves who obviously would be seeing the film. So we made a decision very early on to be very, very discerning with how much of the video we wanted to use, and like what audio effects we wanted with it. And so we would, blur certain things or crop out certain things to avoid that loop, that you see on social media where things just kind of get played over and over again. So we made that decision early on about trying to be as respectful as possible, while also I think it actually made it so that when you do see the videos, or when we do have those moments where they talk about the violence or the trauma, it's maybe more impactful because you get these sort of sharp, precise moments of it without it be stretching out throughout the whole film. So I would say the first choice we made was just about the footage itself in terms of how much we use and how we used it. And then from there, we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the character arcs. We shot for these people over 2 years. We spent a lot of time with them. what are we saying the story is or what are we saying the arc is. And we definitely resisted this idea of just like a simple empowerment arc. I think that it's very easy to say these women are heroes, they're witnesses, they're here, you know, da da, they're superwomen, da da. But in talking to them, we knew that they really wanted their vulnerability to be recognized, and that however well intentioned it is, when you only show people as heroes and activists and you ignore the ways that they were confused or scared or felt abandoned, you're ignoring that vulnerability and that humanity.
Hmm.
So it actually was very important to show them being heartbroken or confused or feeling exploited or making mistakes, in addition to, you know, the bravery that went into their acts of recording, because that was the way to humanize them and be truthful and respectful of their stories. I think that, you know, again, in pitching the film a lot and talking to people, there was a lot of belief that this was just going to be like a rah-rah, you know, activist led, you know, rebellious. And it just wasn't that. And it felt like it would be really, really unfair to try to force it into that. And, you know, Diamond and Darnell have both seen the film and they were both really, really resonant with and grateful for having the vulnerability explored in those ways, so that they're not either presented as pure victims or pure heroes. They're presented as human beings who kind of like flow in and out of, you know, either side of it, like we all do.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, that's the thing that makes it a piece of art, you know, I think, you know, makes it a beautiful film, you know, because not that there aren't places for activist documentaries out there in the world and stuff, but like this is the one where it's just like, um, you know, I think this is a film that I hope will generate lots of conversation after people see it, you know, and just, you know, not just about the issues in the film, but also just, you know, the humanness, you know, of all. So, well, thanks again for, you know, sharing this beautiful film with us and being part of SF Doc Fest. Really appreciate it, Sydney.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much to all the viewers. I really, really appreciate it.
Very cool. All the best with everything.
Thank you. I'll see you soon.